This is Doug Richards with Glacial Lake Organics, LLC. We are dealers for Dakota Rev. Wherever you farm, whatever you grow, we can help you grow it better with Dakota Rev. Our website is www.revuporganics.com. Feel free to give us a call. Check out our website. We're happy to visit at any time.
I'm coming home, baby, now. I'm coming home now, right away. I'm coming home, baby, now. I'm sorry now I ever went away. Every night and day I go and stay. I'm coming home, baby.
Come on home.
Coming home, baby, now.
You know I'm waiting here for you.
I'm coming home now real soon.
You've been gone.
Coming home, baby, now.
You don't know what I'm going through.
I'm coming home, I know I'm overdue.
Since you went away.
Expect me any day now, real soon. I'm coming home.
Come on home.
Coming home, baby, now.
You know I'm praying every night.
And everything is gonna be fine.
Please come on.
Coming home, baby, now.
I want to feel you hold me tight.
Expect to see me now anytime.
When I'm in.
Welcome to the Alpha Ag Summit. We want to thank you for attending on whatever platform you're streaming this program on. My name's Dwayne Murley. I'm with KWMT Radio in Fort Dodge, Iowa. I'll be moderating the panel along with my screener this afternoon, Greg Akagi, and we invite you to join in the discussion by posting your comments and questions as we will monitor them. When appropriate, we'll actually pose those questions to the panelists, and we want to thank our panelists for their time and willingness to share their thoughts, viewpoints, and experience. Please check out their bios and backgrounds on the speakers page. And thank you to our sponsors for their support of the Alpha Ag Summit. This live discussion on weather is being brought to you by Glacial Lake Organics and Schuld Homes. Whatever you grow, grow it better with Dakota Rev organic carbon products from Glacial Lake Organics. Dakota Rev is full of beneficial microbes and organisms. Find out more at revuporganics.com. And again, you can click on the sponsor's logo page for more information. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our panel. And first, I would like to welcome meteorologist Dan Holliday. Dan was raised on a farm east of El Dorado, Kansas, and in 2006 earned certification as a broadcast meteorologist through Mississippi State University. Dan is a member of the National Weather Association and an American Meteorologist Society member. Now, Dan is president and co-founder of the Storm Report Radio Network. Dan, thank you for joining the panel here this afternoon.
Thank you, Dwayne. I really appreciate it.
And next, I welcome Dr. Dennis Toddy to the program. Dr. Toddy is the director of the USDA Midwest Climate Hub in Ames, Iowa. The hub delivers actionable weather, climate information for agriculture in an eight-state region over most of the Corn Belt. Dr. Toddy is a native Iowan and married with 4 children. Dr. Toddy, thank you for joining the panel today.
Happy to be here.
And our third panelist today is Dr. Elwyn Taylor. Dr. Taylor is a well-known expert in climate impacts on agriculture and life in the Midwest. He is widely recognized for his clear explanations of the complexities of long-term weather variability and is an agronomy professor emeritus at Iowa State University, where he worked and taught for more than 40 years. Elwyn, thank you for joining us on the panel today.
I'm pleased to be with you.
And before we begin, we need to remind everyone that views and opinions expressed on this summit are not those of Alpha Media and do not represent the viewpoints of Alpha Ag Network stations, their farm directors, or management. This broadcast is protected by copyright law, and credit should be given wherever sharing or reposting of this video does occur. And again, we want to thank our sponsors here today, Glacial Lake Organics and Schuld Homes. And I'm going to open up the panel this afternoon with Dan Holliday. And Dan, let's talk about the recent cold snap we had. I know you've got some farm roots and kind of talk about that. This was a far-reaching weather pattern that we had.
Yeah, so there was some information that was released recently from actually some of the climatologists that were talking about what exactly happened, because it's not something that we see every winter. And it's believed that there was some warming in the upper levels of the atmosphere near the polar region, further north. And what that did was it caused some of the air to sort of modify a little bit and spill over the jet stream, go a little bit further south. And then you have another oscillation pattern, which is in a negative phase. And so with that occurring, it allowed the jet stream to be a little weaker. It ultimately buckled and came much further south. And so what you really had is cold air just spilling much further south than it typically does, and it stayed around a lot longer than it normally does. And so for that reason, so many people, they experienced just something that they had not seen. Some had not seen in a lifetime, but overall, it's kind of redefined the word cold here this season.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Dr. Taylor, I want to ask you, is that a typical weather pattern that we saw, that Arctic air blast, or was it maybe different from ones we've seen in the past?
Well, whenever you talk about a polar outbreak or the polar vortex opening up and it's pouring in on us, that's what we experienced again. And it's not an every year thing, but then it's not something unknown to people in the Midwest either.
Now, Dr. Toddy, this reached the far southern parts of the United States, and talk about that a little bit as far as the region that it actually covered over the last week and a half or 2 weeks.
Right. Basically everything east of the Rockies saw some of the penetration of the very deep cold, and it stuck around, as our previous presenters talked about. Up in the upper Midwest, it was cold, but it was not too much record setting. It's a little bit later in the year, but we're susceptible to extreme cold this time of year. But you're right. The cold did penetrate all the way down to Texas, where we're hearing the many issues from it. But it did have some agricultural issues along with it, related to livestock, some stress on livestock, and some stress on winter wheat that we're expecting to see too.
Now, do you think this could be a long-term effect right on through the growing season, or what are your thoughts there, Dr. Toddy?
There's been some discussion about some resurgence of cold in March, and it's possible we'll get a little bit of it. We're not going to see something of that extreme nature anytime in March. And looking at some of the models right now, it doesn't look like we're going to get too much cold, and anything that is cold will be much more shorter lived. I'm actually a bit more concerned about the opposite and getting back to warmer, which people like to have, but it brings some other issues along with it.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess talk about some of those issues that we could experience because of that.
Definitely. We've had some precipitation in parts of the southern plains, so soil moisture is not too bad. But you go further west in the southern plains and the northern plains, and we have some relatively dry soils. And in some of those places, we didn't have much snowfall yet this year either. So when you add those dry soils with some warmer conditions, you start putting the pieces together, and certainly some spring dryness is a real problem. You have carryover dryness that hit some of the winter wheat last year, some of the cold related to that, some cold damage, and now potential dryness or continuation or expansion of drought. And you've got a real bad combination of a set of things that could be happening throughout a good chunk of the plains, actually.
Right. Now, Dr. Taylor, I was going to have you kind of expand on what Dr. Toddy just talked about with the dryness and so forth, and drought and so forth, and talk about that a little bit, the area that you're familiar with, and maybe some of the things you're seeing right now.
I've been getting quite a few calls from farmers. Many of those that call have drainage tile in their land. My first question is, if they have tile, is it running? And the vast majority, right up through this week, is that, yes, the tiles are still running. And so not everybody's been out there to look at them. Some of them say, I can still see a little steam coming up from where I know the tile outlets are. And so that means that there's still some excess moisture in the top 5 feet, at least somewhere near the depth that the drainage tile is installed. And so still some excess coming out there. We've received some snow around the area, and the snow level is going down. That means that it's melting at the bottom. The soils are not frozen. I was looking at the soil temperature at the 4-inch depth around the state of Iowa and the immediate neighboring areas to Iowa. And I found very few reports of 30 degrees Fahrenheit or less. That, in other words, for the most part, we do not have frost in the soil. We've got snow cover, but the soil is not frozen in most areas.
And talk a little bit more about the snow cover, because we've gotten more snow probably this year than recent years. And talk about how far the snow cover is going to go. I've always heard that maybe 12 inches of snow equates to 1 inch of rain or liquid precipitation. Talk about that, because maybe that is deceiving with the snow cover and what that's actually going to formulate into liquid precipitation.
Now, the best estimate that we have is the tin can estimate, and a few farmers have called in to me with that, and they told me they had 3/4 of an inch of water when their 1 gallon pan that they had out, when they brought it in and let the snow melt. So a couple of them had a 1/2 inch, and I think that was the lowest value that I had.
I want to come back to Dan Holliday. Dan, I know 6 to 10 day forecast or something that you focus on, 2-day forecast, and we get a lot of feedback from our listeners that really have an interest in this 1.5 to 10 day forecast, and talk about how that works into the information that you're talking about, and just how valuable that 6 to 10 day forecast is.
Well, it's certainly valuable now because everybody is asking the question, is this going to happen again? They're worried about what just occurred, everything from their heating bill all the way to livestock and the farm in general. But what we do is we look at computer models, and those computer models give you sort of an estimate of what will happen. And it's the old-fashioned yet high-tech weather balloon that gets all that data and sends it back to various National Weather Service offices. And then they have an algorithm that puts that all into a computer system. And from that, we can kind of see what's going to unfold. Like I would say probably, I was looking just a little bit ago, what's called the GFS model. That allows us to look out a little bit further, maybe a couple of weeks. We know that can change because there can be certain patterns that can shift that. The models may be getting some bad data, but for the most part, it gives you a pretty good handle on a storm system that's coming in. We can see around the 8th or 9th, there's going to be a storm coming into the Midwest, pretty strong low pressure system, bringing some snow, it looks like, to parts of the northern plains, and then rain further south. But overall, the next 6 to 10 days, there's some weak disturbances coming through, but nothing really significant like what we saw the last couple of weeks.
Now, Dr. Toddy, back to you. Are we starting to see some changes in trends when it comes to climate and weather across the Midwest?
Sorry about that. I was muted myself. We could spend the rest of the time talking about this because there's a number of different pieces we can talk about. One of the biggest ones, especially in the northern plains and chunks of the Midwest, has been overall getting wetter, a lot of that occurring in the springtime, which has led to some of those problems. Dr. Taylor talked about some of the drain tiles running. A more frequent issue than this has been, wetness in the springtime, sometimes cool temperatures, but definitely wetness that has slowed down some of the planting progress. We're somewhat less concerned about that this year, given some of the soil moisture conditions. Warming winters is another thing that we're often seeing, and we saw a lot of that this year until this last few weeks where we've had very cold temperatures. Those are the two bigger ones that we've seen. There's some more esoteric ones that we could talk about. The other one, I guess, maybe in the summertime, are changes in the summertime, especially in the northern plains and Midwest. Our changes in summertime temperatures we're seeing warmer overnight temperatures, and our daytime highs are either high or in some cases they're going down a little bit. But overall, we're warming because those overnight temperatures are warming up more than what's happening in our daytimes. So that's really kind of changing the dynamic of what we see. Maybe not as extreme high temperatures, but lots more warm overnight temperatures, which has a different set of impacts on agriculture.
Now, we are starting to see maybe some trends change as far as soybean planting. Some farmers that are planting earlier than what they typically would have, say, 5 or 6 years ago. Do you think that's kind of playing an effect into it too, where the weather patterns are a little bit warmer earlier in the year?
Right. Definitely. The warming winters, we're getting to spring. We're getting to spring earlier on average. There's still a lot of variability in the spring, so we still have some frost issues, but definitely some earlier planting, and also part of this movement northward in corn and soybeans that we've seen over the last couple decades is part of that too. That the overall warming and some increase in precipitation is opening up some areas for us to move in the way of our production areas.
Right. Now I want to come back to Dan. Dan, what are you seeing as far as maybe some effects when it comes to farmers, whether it be grain production or livestock production, and maybe how some of these changes in the weather are affecting them on the farm?
Well, it's interesting. I grew up on a farm, and my dad farmed until recently and then retired. So I haven't spoken to a whole lot of people this year in terms of what they experienced. But the few that I did just mention, obviously, that cold snap put a stress on not only them getting out and doing the chores, but also the livestock themselves. I think overall, now that we're looking ahead and we're probably out of that, I guess what you could call a scare, or what we went through with that long cold period, we're probably looking at more of a situation where things are going to be more normal, more typical for this time of year, because the weather is certainly transitioning into what we would typically expect for the end of February and early March. So what I've heard, at least from the few people I've talked at, they're not overly concerned unless we would experience something again like that, and it doesn't obviously look like we will.
Right. I want to come back to Dr. Taylor. Elwyn, do the changes in temperature and precipitation, do they correlate with one another? Do we normally see one when we see the other?
They usually do go together. If there is a change in precipitation, there's almost always a change in temperature, at least at the time of the precipitation. It doesn't mean that it's changed for the whole season, but sometimes it does. If we get just a control of a high pressure that maybe is sitting down in the area of Florida, and that is not a happy thing for them if they have high pressure, because they lose their crops in the winter. But occasionally it does happen. More often, our cold comes from Canada, and our moisture comes from the Gulf here in Iowa. And for our neighbors, I tell people if you're interested in moisture coming up from the Gulf, first check and see how things have hit Arkansas, and assume that we're about 7 days behind what's going on there.
Now, I want you to stay with me here, Elwyn. I know you often talk about our 89-year cycle, our weather cycle. Talk about that a little bit. Share that with our audience, not only a weather pattern, but also a little bit of history involved with this too.
Well, the 89-year cycle is something that I didn't learn about in school, but I ended up doing a lot of talking about. But I just noticed from the history books that the roughest year for agriculture in Iowa in the 1800s, that would be extreme southeast Iowa, was 1846, 1847. That was a hot, dry summer, followed, and they had an associated cold winter when the Mississippi River froze over, became a highway, and it did that for a couple of 2 or 3 years. That people found that was the best in the winter road to move materials from down at the what would be the southeast end of Iowa, all the way up into Minnesota, up at the cities area. We don't count on that anymore, but they did back at that time. Now, when we look out past that, we had this 1847, then we had 1935, 36, 37, and now here we are again. You might say, are we going to go through the same type of thing? Is there really an 89-year cycle that does exist and happens regularly, or did it just happen 2 or 3 times in a row and now people are gun shy of it, that this could be the next time?
Now, what would the year be should we be in that 89-year cycle?
So the peak of it would be 24 and 25. The coldest, wettest winter and the hottest, driest summer, the way these things work. If it's really here and it is really going to have the same effect that it did the last two times that this was a major factor in the Midwest, meaning Iowa and the immediate neighbors in this case.
Now that we're 2 to 3 years ahead of that, or just be ahead of that time period, are we consistent right now with the weather patterns we're seeing that were the same patterns that built up to those years before?
That is the thing that first got my attention. They're almost identical to the records that we had, but remember the records were all down in the extreme southeast Iowa and adjacent Illinois, just across the river. And so we're talking about down in that area where we have records that go back for a long period of time. The records for the state of Iowa and the north half of Illinois are really pretty scant.
Okay, very good. When we come back, I want to visit with Dr. Toddy and have him talk about El Nino and La Nina. But first, I want to take a second here to thank our sponsors who are on board today. The Alpha Ag Summit sponsor, Hitchpin. You can find out more about Hitchpin at hitchpin.com or by logging on to alphaagsummit.com. And while you're there, make sure you sign up for a 4-day trip to Sarasota, Florida to enjoy deep sea fishing with our friends at Double Nickel Siesta Key Charters. And again, you can find out more at alphaagsummit.com. And we want to thank our sponsors today for the weather portion of the summit today, being brought to you by Glacial Lake Organics and Schuld Homes. Whatever you grow it better with Dakota Rev Organic Carbon Products from Glacial Lake Organics. Dakota Rev is full of beneficial microbes and organisms. Find out more at revuporganics.com. And again, you can find out more as well at alphaagsummit.com. And Dr. Toddy, if you would, let's talk about El Nino and La Nina. That seems to be two weather phrases that are on people's minds. And I guess kind of break the two down and talk about the difference between the two.
Right. When we're talking about this, we're talking about changes in what's happening in the Pacific along the equator specifically. And when we're talking about El Nino, we're talking about a warming of the waters in the eastern part of the Pacific and cooling in the west. La Nina is the opposite phase, cooling of waters in the east and warming in the west. They have more direct effects on Argentina. People have been talking about that, watching what's happening in Argentina this year with some of the dryness issues they've had down there. It has a more indirect effect on North America and the Midwest and plains. We've been watching this because we are in a La Nina, the La Nina side phase of this throughout the winter, and there are some things that we expect to happen during La Ninas, and it's kind of been an atypical La Nina, but we can point to some things in previous La Ninas, and those the biggest point to monitor with these is it does increase our predictability several months in advance on some issues. And so a lot of the outlooks have been based off La Nina this year. So we've been expecting dryness in the southern part of the U.S. and wetness up around the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley. And some of that has played out. It's been a more typical La Nina pattern later in the winter. Now we're watching that. The La Nina is likely to weaken by summertime, but we're still expecting some impacts of this as we go along into the spring. And that is why we have some of these concerns about dryness throughout a good chunk of the plains, because that is a more typical La Nina pattern in the springtime. We have some concerns if La Nina lasts into summertime, because La Nina increases our chances of drought issues in the summertime. Right now, it doesn't look like it's going to last into summertime, but we'll have to keep an eye on that. But the biggest thing is there are different patterns, different times of year. We have some issues with agriculture related to this, but they do give us some predictability capabilities looking several months in advance.
And talk about the agricultural side of that, Dr. Toddy, because we are seeing the effects of maybe heavy moisture or lack of moisture, like you said, in South America, whether they're delaying harvest and delaying the new crop that's being put in the ground right now. Talk about that a little bit, because at times it seems like that is kind of a driver of the markets from day to day.
Well, when you're looking for something weather-wise to drive the market, and La Nina and El Nino give you something to hang your hat on, I drawing a blank on what's happening in South America. I don't keep an eye on South America as closely as I should. It's not my area of responsibility. But in the U.S., we have some concerns that way because we have some of these dry soil issues in parts of the plains. And La Nina in the springtime increases our chances of drought in the plains. So definitely that's something that people are probably looking at in this area. The rest of the Corn Belt, we're going to have to wait and see what happens, because if the spring plays out the way it should, we should be wetter in the eastern Corn Belt, and then that would give us some soil moisture to work with and reduce our potential drought issues in the rest of the Corn Belt. But there's still a lot to be decided of what's going on here. The bigger part of this is the dryness in the Southwest. Certainly, if you look at the U.S. Drought Monitor and what's going on in the Southwest, extremely dry conditions throughout much of the Southwest, and they've not had a whole lot of improvement this year that they really needed to have from an overall water standpoint.
And Dan Holliday, I'd like to come back to you and talk about how the El Nino and La Nina models, when it comes to weather forecasting, how that affects your role from day to day.
Well, it's certainly one of the there's a number of different things that we look at. It's just one of the tools, but obviously, as Dr. Toddy had described, we look at these types of patterns to see if things are going to change. In fact, I was speaking with a gentleman at a radio station in Northern California, where last winter they hardly could buy any rain or snow. They haven't had much in the way of snow where they are east of Sacramento, but yet they're having a little bit more rain than they typically do in the winter. So it's interesting how it plays out. But from a forecasting standpoint, for what we do and I do for radio, we will look at that as sort of a tool. We'll say, what are the patterns being, and oftentimes people are very interested in what the El Nino is going to do every year. And sometimes, or La Nina in this case this year, you just don't know, because other things can come into play that can change that.
Now, Dan, I want to stay with you. We've got a question from one of our viewers here this afternoon. Based on what we've seen over the past few years, has Tornado Alley seemingly moved to the southeastern part of the U.S.?
Well, there's always some severe weather in the southeastern U.S., typically because they are warm and humid, and oftentimes in the winter we get severe weather that happens there as well, because the jet stream dives into the plains. It's a little bit closer to them. It gives them all the fuel they need for severe weather. And we saw a couple of severe weather outbreaks in 2020, early in the year, and then things just quieted down in the central part of the country. There was a number of factors for that, but it's hard to say long term if that's really what's happening. It seems like, for instance, in Kansas, where I grew up, we always have tornadoes, but last year, again, there were only, I believe, 17 in the state. Oklahoma, Missouri didn't see many either. I think there were more in Minnesota than there were in the Central Plains. So to say long-term, or at least in the short term, it's moved to the southeast. I think the southeast will always have their fair share of severe weather, but I don't know if that will basically elude us this year, because it seems like those of us in the central part of the country, we certainly escaped the typical severe weather. There were weeks upon weeks that we just didn't have anything at all. So this year, I think we're kind of anticipating something more will happen than what happened in 2020.
Now, Dr. Taylor, I want to come back to you while we're talking about the Southeast. I've often heard you refer to keeping an eye on the Southeast when it comes to drought across the United States. And I guess talk about that a little bit, maybe a spinoff of the question we just had.
It's been an interesting history. When we've had serious agricultural drought, they almost always have a couple of years before the drought in the Midwest. It was in South and North Carolina, or else it was down in the Georgia, Alabama area. And it seems like if they have a droughty situation, it increases the risk of having it follow up in the Midwest the next year or 2 years later. I don't know exactly what the natural physics of that would be, but historically, we can almost always count on if there was a drought in the Midwest, it was a year or two ahead of the Midwest in the South, North Carolina, or in East Texas and along the Gulf Coast.
Now, Dr. Toddy, I want to come back to you. You've been doing a lot of live and online programs with Iowa State University, and I guess I want to ask you about the feedback you're hearing. What are you hearing from those in attendance, their concerns with weather or how weather is related to agriculture?
Well, it's always very interesting what people are asking. For a while, people always want to know about drought, because drought is the biggest player, usually the biggest yield impactor looking across the Corn Belt, and they're wondering when the next drought is coming, because it was a chance to drive prices. Because it would change their marketing situation. Actually, they wanted drought everywhere else, but not near them. So this year with the dryness in western Iowa and up in the plains and a bit up into the northern plains, ongoing questions about how that's going to continue, what the recovery situation from that is going to be. There's always are we going to get in the field early? What's our situation there? And those types of things. So we're getting some longer term discussions, longer term thoughts about what are the changes and how can we start adapting to those changes. But it's been more the nearer term issues that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, you talk about getting into the field early. Do you get more feedback on getting into the field early, or how harvest is going to go, or what part of the growing season, I guess, probably generates the most interest?
Yes, all of them. From my time in South Dakota and some of the problems I mentioned earlier with getting wetter in the springs, that has people really gun shy in the way of wanting to get in early, because when delays set in, it's very hard to catch up afterwards. You can't accumulate more degree days very well to be able to catch up. And we saw the worst of that in 2019, a little bit last year in North Dakota, but the worst of it in 2019. So that's always the biggest issue. And that's when we try to talk with people too, is look at some of the larger issues and say, what do we see coming, to give them a little bit of recommendation. So, this year, because of the fairly dry fall, we're not nearly as wet going in. The snow is, the warm temperatures and high sun angle are making quick work on snow cover right now. So we don't have the large term dryness that we've had some other years. So we are more optimistic about getting able to get in to do early field work.
You talked about South Dakota, and I was going to ask you as a follow-up, I'm sure you keep in contact with farmers and extension personnel that you work with in South Dakota. Do you find that farmers in different states in the Corn Belt and the Southern Plains have the same concerns when it comes to weather?
There's always concerns about weather. There's always concerns. But there are, some more chronic issues in certain areas. Drought tends to be a more chronic problem in the Southern Plains than in the Northern Plains. Some of the delays in planting have been more of a Northern Plains, Upper Midwest issue than they've been some other places. Because, especially in the Northern Plains, you're still dealing with a fairly short growing season. It's lengthening, but it's still fairly short growing season. So they're really concerned about how quickly they can get out there and get things in the ground because of that shorter growing season.
Right. I want to come back to Dr. Taylor. Dr. Toddy talked about growing degree days, and with your background as an agronomist and climatologist, I guess, talk about how important growing degree days are when it comes to raising that crop.
Well, growing degree days are really the only way we have to make some anticipation of what is happening. The people look out there in the field and they see how the crop is looking, and they know that at the moment. But how is it going to develop is really the growing degree days. There's two sides to this: not warm enough to have growth and development of the crop. And the second thing is too much warmth, and either things happening too fast or water being used too fast and leaving things under a stress because of lack of available water. And so either way, there's a problem, and that's why this becomes such an important factor that farmers consider.
Now, Dan, I want to come back to you. I know your weather forecast, you work with crop producers, you work with livestock producers, and so forth. Do you find that those two have the same concerns when it comes to weather and just exactly the information that you're delivering?
Well, everyone wants to know the longest term forecast they possibly can, usually. And that truly is tough to do because there are days when we try and forecast what's going to happen in 24 hours, and it can be a challenge. So I think they both want the same information. They want long-term information as much as they can. And so what we try and do is just pass on the best data that we can and inform them. But overall, I would say that that 6 to 10 day time frame that we talk about is really crucial to kind of giving them the guidance that they need and what to do in terms of working for the next week to 10 days ahead.
Now, Dr. Toddy, I want to come back to you. We've talked about the changes that we've seen in temperature as well as moisture and so forth. Talk about the stress that this causes to agriculture, and I guess really beyond that, even other natural resources.
It's it really is interesting because there are some things that we can take advantage of, but there are some other problems that we're seeing related to that. Some of that excess wetness is leading to problems with soil compaction. We mentioned the 2019, the delays in 2019. And when I talked with people, I said, how many of you think we did a lot of long-term soil damage because of people trying to go into too wet fields? And you see a lot of hands raised going, yeah, we were trying to get crop in and we ended up doing some compaction issues. So, and that combined with additional precipitation on top of uncovered ground is adding to our soil loss issue. So that's a real concern that we have is, that's our resource. That's the resource we've got to protect and trying to encourage people to do what they can to protect that resource. The additional warming during the summertime, that's starting to put some different kinds of stresses on crop. We talked about growing degree days. The additional heat in the evenings is adding those growing degree days, not stressing the crop as much during as excess heat, but moving the crop more quickly through its phenological phases. And, we can see some yield loss in some of those years also. These warm, the overall warming in the summertime is not so much, I mentioned not as much higher temperatures, but we're getting more days with warm temperatures and high humidities. That's not so bad for crops, but that's problematic for livestock. And especially when you don't cool down at nighttime, that adds stress to livestock. So, you may not lose livestock. There have been some big livestock loss events, but you lose productivity, you stress the crop, they don't gain weight as much. So those are some of the issues that we track in different areas around the region.
Now, Dr. Taylor, I've heard you talk about the effects of compaction on soil and growing conditions and so forth. I guess I would have you talk a little bit more about that and just the effects. I mean, it's not something that is just going to clear itself up in a year, 2 years, 3 years. We could see effects many years down the road.
Well, I learned most of that from my father by my mistakes and his observations. One time I just drove the pickup right across the middle of the field because that was the shortest way to get lunch to him. And he said, never do that again. Those tracks will still be across this field in 20 years. Well, just because of the kind of kid I was, 20 years later, I went back and he was right. You could still determine where I had compacted the soils. So that is always a concern. Once you've compacted the soils, they're very, very long time in recovering back to as productive as they were before, even though it may just be a tire track that you cut the production in. I don't know if that covered what you wanted me to mention or not, but that was the first thoughts.
Well, I think we just know the effects, long-term effects, I guess, of compaction. And Dr. Toddy, I want to come back to you here this afternoon. Talk about the increasing number and intensity of extreme events and whether the polar vortex we saw over the last week and a half or 2 weeks that was extreme, or I guess talk about whether that's growing in intensity and so forth.
Well, that's automatically the first thing when you have under bigger events is what are the longer term changes, and what do they contribute to some of these big events. There is lots of discussion about what is the contribution of that. Certainly with the warming of the poles, the polar ice cap, that is going to change how we interact from the polar latitudes down to here. And there's still a lot of discussion about that. Certainly we have some more big event types of things. The derecho through the Midwest this summer, lots of hurricanes, other big storm events, fires in the West, and drought in a good portion of the West too. You're dealing with a combination of changing sizes of events, along with we just have more people around and more things that are at risk. So you have a bigger combination of big events with we've moved a lot of people to the southeast, right in the path of hurricanes. So there's a damage level there, but it's certainly something that we are concerned about. The insurance industry folks are well ahead of us. They've been talking about this for over 10 years, saying they've seen the indemnities going through the roof. So that's a definite concern as we're looking ahead, is the damage being caused by these bigger events.
All right. Before we wrap up here, I'm going to ask for closing comments from each of our guests here this afternoon. We'll begin with Dr. Toddy when we come back, but I want to take another moment here to thank our sponsor, the Alpha Ag Summit sponsor, Hitchpin. You can learn more about Hitchpin at hitchpin.com or by logging on to our Alpha Ag Summit website at alphaagsummit.com. And while you're there, make sure you register for a 4-day trip to Sarasota, Florida to enjoy deep sea fishing with our friends at Double Nickel Siesta Key Charters. And again, we want to thank our weather panel sponsors today, Glacial Lake Organics and Schuld Homes. Wherever you grow, or whatever you grow it better with Dakota Rev organic carbon products from Glacial Lake Organics. Dakota Rev is full of beneficial microbes and organisms. Find out more at revuporganics.com. And again, our Alpha Ag Summit sponsor, Hitchpin. And you can learn more about Hitchpin at hitchpin.com. And as we wrap up the panel here today, I'd like to begin with Dr. Dennis Tody, if you've got some closing comments, and I would like you to include too in there your role at the USDA Midwest Climate Hub in Ames and the information that you gather at the center.
Thanks. I was going to do that anyway. Thanks for having me here today. I appreciate always getting out to talk to people about weather and climate and ag issues. Our role with the Midwest Climate Hub is our 8-state region is the eastern part of the Corn Belt. Western part of the Corn Belt is on the Northern Plains Climate Hub. But we work to try to develop information, share information about current and projected climate conditions for people to be making sustainable decisions in the way of climate. And that's a large part of what we do. And with the near-term events, these are things we're always trying to keep track of also. So we're always engaging with our NOAA partners and other federal and state partners to collect and share information as part of what we do. We're always happy to do that and love getting that opportunity to do that.
Boy, you shared a lot of great information with us today. Thank you for that. And next, I want to move on to Dan Holliday, some closing comments. And of course, Dan's the president and co-founder of the Storm Report Radio Network. And Dan, if we could share some closing comments here today.
Yeah, well, what we do is we do forecast and severe weather updates for radio stations across the country. And I would just say, closing on this cold snap event, I think that's still on everyone's mind. I had spoken to someone just northwest of San Antonio this morning, and he had told me that his radio tower collapsed a couple of weeks ago. And my question was, do you have de-icers, like they do further north? And he said, that is just not something we have on towers. And there were a number of towers, testament to how strong this system was, because the infrastructure further south in Texas, folks just were not at all prepared for dealing with something like that, just because it hung on so long. So we'll see the effects with farms and ranches. I'm sure there's going to be insurance claims, a lot of them, no doubt, that are already being filed. So that's going to be a big impact. And coming ahead here in the next month, we're already getting, people asking about severe weather season. So time to get prepared for severe weather all over the central part of the country. All
right. Well said again, Dan Holliday. Thank you for your time today as well.
Thank you.
And we'll wrap up this afternoon with Dr. Elwyn Taylor. Some closing comments, Elwyn, as we wrap the program up today.
Well, I would like to wish everyone the best for this growing season, and it is not likely to be the very best of growing seasons. Nevertheless, we do have history to look at, and we pay attention to what's gone on in the past because it is our only and real idea of what the weather can bring to us, and very well may do, especially during this next 2 or 3 years. This is not the time to, let's say, spend foolishly. This is the time to plan on unknowns and take advantage of when it means something in crop prices, and don't be destroyed by when it means something the wrong direction.
Dr. Taylor, thank you for your time today as well. And that is going to do it for discussion on the weather panel today. We want to once again thank our panelists, Dan Holliday, Dr. Dennis Toddy, and Dr. Elwyn Taylor. And thanks to all the producers who joined in live or those who will view this session at some time in the future. The Alpha Ag Network, along with our sponsors, are proud to bring you this Ag Summit. A special thanks to our presenting sponsor, Hitchpin.com, and Alpha Ag Network, your local farm programming promoting, respecting, and celebrating the industry that drives our communities' agriculture. And again, I want to thank my partner here, Greg Akagi, who is running things behind the scenes, and also Dan Weddick. We appreciate Dan and Greg being on board as well. And again, Dr. Taylor and Dan Holliday, Dennis Toddy, thank you for your time as we wrap up the weather panel on the Alpha Ag Network.